The night of the show was electric. 40,000 fans filled the stadium waiting for Elvis Presley to start his performance. But just when the music was beginning to peak, a drunk heckler shouted something that stopped the show cold. The crowd froze, unsure of what was going on. Security moved in, trying to resolve the situation, and Elvis had little time to calculate his next step. Every eye turned to the king, standing tall under the lights. And in that tense moment, Elvis did something no one expected. Something that left the entire crowd stunned. Join us as we find out how Elvis was able to handle this drama. One more night. The air around the stadium was filled with heat and noise. Outside the gates, cars kept arriving one after another, headlights cutting through the dark. Vendors shouted and pushed small carts filled with soda, peanuts, and cold beer. Every corner around the massive building was alive with people talking, laughing, waving tickets in the air. They had waited for hours, some since the early morning, and now the time had finally come. It was a warm summer night, and the smell of dust and sweat mixed with the sweet smell of food. Inside the stadium, every seat was full. The bright floodlights poured across the stage, catching the faces of the crowd. Fans held up small banners, and some stood on their seats trying to look closer. The sound of thousands of voices filled the air, a thick, constant uproar that moved from one side of the arena to the other. The noise rose and fell like the wind, blending with the echo of footsteps, laughter, and applause. There was no room for stillness. Everyone was waiting for the same man, Elvis Presley. Behind the main stage, hidden from the crowd, the band was setting up. Technicians rushed across the floor, checking cables, adjusting microphones, tightening drum heads. The metallic thud of guitars being tuned echoed through the back hallway. A few of the crew members moved fast but tried not to show their fright. They had seen this before, but each concert had its own pressure. When 40,000 people were watching, one mistake could turn into chaos. The stage smelled of heat and electricity, the wooden boards warm from the lights above. In a small dressing room just behind the stage, Elvis stood in front of a wide mirror bordered with yellow bulbs. His white jumpsuit glittered with blue stones that caught every bit of light. His hair was slicked back perfectly. He took slow breaths, letting the noise from outside reach him like waves hitting a wall. Each cheer reminded him of what was waiting out there, 40,000 faces ready to scream his name. The noise didn't scare him, it fed him. He was born for it. The sound, the pressure, the bright lights, it all gave him life. Down the hallway, the sound engineer gave a signal. The house lights began to fade. The crowd sensed it immediately. The low chatter turned to a rumble and then to a roar. The big screens came alive with color, flashing across the faces of the audience. From the back rows to the front, people stood up, clapping and shouting, eyes fixed on the stage. The band moved into place. The drummer tapped his sticks together. The lead guitarist adjusted the strap on his shoulder and looked toward the curtain, waiting for the cue. The first low note from the bass rolled through the stadium, deep and steady. It hit the seats, the walls, and the floor like a pulse. The crowd screamed louder. The rhythm picked up, drums joining in, guitars snapping bright across the dark air. The lights burst back to life, washing the stage in gold and red. The band played harder, faster, driving the sound higher until the tension broke. Then through the curtain, Elvis appeared. The moment he stepped out, the sound from the audience changed. It wasn't just cheering anymore. It was a raw wave of sound, something that came from the gut, as if thousands of people had released everything they had been holding back. The flash from cameras sparkled like stars. Elvis took one step forward, gripping the microphone in his hand, his smile wide and easy. The spotlight followed him, cutting a sharp white circle on the floor where he stood. The music shifted and the crowd followed his every move. His voice hit the first note with power that filled the stadium from end to end. The words rolled out strong and smooth, carried by the echo of the sound system. His body moved with rhythm, not wild but natural, as if the music controlled his steps. The stage lights bounced off his jacket, scattering light across the faces below. Each gesture, each sway of his hand drew a louder reaction from the fans. They weren't just listening, they were part of it. From the back rows, the crowd looked like a restless sea. People jumped, waved their hands, danced, and sang along. The floor shook slightly with their movement. Security guards lined the front, trying to hold back the wave of fans pressing closer to the stage. A few people fainted from the heat and excitement, but nobody wanted to leave. The whole place was alive. Every seat, every corner, every railing vibrating from the sound. The smell of sweat and smoke hung in the air, mixed with perfume and faint traces of beer. Every song flowed into the next with barely a pause. The cameras kept flashing, freezing his image over and over again. The crowd still swayed and clapped, unwilling to let the electricity in the air fade away. Everyone knew the night wasn't close to over. The excitement hadn't peaked yet. The audience leaned forward, faces lit by the soft glow from the stage, waiting to see what Elvis would do next. The show was still young, and the night had already burned itself into memory. The unexpected disruption. The second half of the concert began with a burst of light that swept across the stadium. The sound of drums rolled deep, shaking the seats. The air was thicker now. People clapped in rhythm as Elvis walked back to the center of the stage, his white suit glittering under the lights. He lifted the microphone, the band waiting behind him for the cue. The crowd was alive again, shouting his name, pushing against the barricades at the front. The energy was steady, almost perfect, but from somewhere in the crowd, something began to shift that balance. Near the middle section of the stands, a man stumbled to his feet. The people around him moved aside as he swayed forward, clutching a bottle of drink in his hand. His shirt was half untucked, and his face filled with sweat and the blur of alcohol. The music drowned his first few words, but his movements caught attention. He leaned forward, shouting again, his voice rising above the song for the first time. Heads turned toward him. The band kept playing, but those nearby stopped clapping. The noise from that part of the stadium was still loud but uneven. Security guards at the front noticed the movement and began to climb up the steps. The man shouted again, this time louder, his words sharp and cutting through the music. The lights swung slightly across the crowd, and for a second his face appeared in the glow, angry and wild. The people next to him tried to calm him down, but he brushed them off and stepped forward again. The music faltered for a moment as one of the guitarists missed a beat. The wave of excitement broke into fragments of whispers and scattered noise. The drunk man raised his drink and pointed toward the stage. His words were clearer now, and though not everyone could hear, those close enough did. He was shouting at Elvis, calling him names, daring him to respond. The rest of the audience turned toward him, the sound of his voice growing more distinct against the music. It was annoying, one angry tone among thousands. The guards moved closer, but the man pushed back, shouting again. The tension spread fast. On stage, Elvis noticed the commotion. He turned slightly, still singing, but his eyes followed the movement in the crowd. The band continued, uncertain whether to stop or play through it. The energy of the concert began to twist, still alive but distorted now. The guards reached the man, trying to pull him away from the edge of the aisle, but he refused to move. He shouted louder, his words echoing above the music. For the first time that night, the band slowed and the rhythm began to fall apart. The sudden stop left the air heavy and uncertain. 40,000 people fell into near stillness, every head turning toward the same point in the stands. As the man kept shouting and waving his arm, the guards held him by the shoulder, trying to drag him back, but his voice rose higher. The sound was more audible now that the music had stopped. Some people in the audience shouted for him to sit down, while others waited, unsure of what was about to happen. The lights from the stage poured over the crowd, catching the faces of those closest to the scene. For a few seconds, the only noise came from the drunk man's voice echoing across the space. He yelled again, his tone sharp and mocking. The crowd booed him harder this time, the noise rising like a protest against him. The guards tightened their grip, but the man resisted, throwing his head back and shouting one last time. The tension snapped through the audience like a live wire. For some moment, no one moved. Every eye was fixed on the stage, waiting to see if Elvis would react. Elvis stood still in the spotlight. His expression was unreadable. The microphone hung loosely in his hand. Behind him, the band members exchanged nervous glances, waiting for a sign. The audience held its breath. The stillness stretched on for several seconds, long enough to be felt on the skin. It was no longer the cheerful energy from earlier. It was sharp and tense. The night had changed. The thrill that had filled the stadium minutes earlier was gone, replaced by shock and confusion. Elvis turned his head slightly, his gaze following the scene in the middle rows. The spotlight stayed fixed on him, his face half-shadowed. It was clear that the show couldn't continue until something broke the tension. Finally, the guards began to move the man down the stairs, one on each side of him. The crowd watched in silence as they forced him toward the exit. He shouted one more time, but the sound barely rose over the noise of the crowd beginning to clap again. The drunk man was led out through a side gate, disappearing into the tunnel under the seats. The stadium was still caught between shock and relief. The people stood, waiting for something to happen, waiting for Elvis to speak, to move, to reclaim the stage. For the first time that night, he had lost their attention to something else. The night that had started with perfect rhythm had suddenly turned unpredictable. Elvis lifted the microphone slightly, looking out over the crowd that had fallen into silence. The moment hung there, suspended, a fragile point between control and chaos. The king of rock and roll stood still, facing thousands of people, and the next move was his. The king's legendary reclaim. The lights above the stage glared hot as Elvis stood motionless. The band's last notes had faded, leaving only a soft hum through the speakers. The crowd had gone from excitement to a strange, uncertain hush. All eyes were on him. Every one of them waited for what he would do next. Elvis tilted his head slightly, listening to the fading echoes from the audience. His right hand tightened around the microphone, but he didn't say a word. The silence had its own weight now, heavier than the music that had filled the air moments ago. Just then, Elvis gave a nod, and without warning, the band came alive again. The first chord exploded through the speakers, sharp and loud, pulling the audience back into the storm of sound. The lights burst into color, sweeping across the stadium in gold and red. The crowd erupted into cheers, louder than before, their voices drowning the echoes of what had just happened. The tension broke in an instant. The night moved forward again, carried by the power of music and the control of the man who had stopped it. The chaos of the last few minutes had vanished under the power of his stillness. He raised the microphone slowly, and the audience leaned in instinctively. His eyes scanned the crowd from the front row to the farthest reaches, making sure every person could feel the shift. Elvis didn't rush into sound. Instead, he allowed the instrumentals to stretch, letting the echo of the incident settle. The stadium had been silent, but the anticipation grew heavier, electric. It was a moment suspended between fear and exhilaration. Finally, he moved, but with a calm authority that instantly commanded attention. His voice came through the speakers, not loud or sharp, but perfectly clear, carrying every word across the stadium. He didn't shout. He didn't mock. He simply reasserted himself, a presence so commanding that the tension in the crowd began to dissipate on its own. The atmosphere changed from uncertain to thrilling. The people who had moments before been confused now leaned forward, watching him as if seeing him for the first time. He stepped toward the edge of the stage, boots shining under the lights, every motion flowing with effortless rhythm. The band followed, adjusting their pace to match the energy he now commanded. The instruments almost exploded immediately, though they built slowly, weaving into the air like threads, creating a cushion of sound that carried the crowd back into the music without erasing the drama of the moment. The energy in the stadium shifted from tension to focus, every person caught in the rhythm he created. Elvis used every inch of the stage, moving side to side, back and forth, his body language perfectly synchronized with the music. Each step was purposeful. The audience followed him, rising and falling with the rhythm of his motion. He never shouted at the heckler or even worry about him for long. Instead, he used his presence to reassert control, turning what could have been a disruption into a moment of joy. The stadium seemed to respond, the roar of 40,000 voices building gradually as the tension finally melted into exhilaration. At one point, he paused briefly, holding the microphone slightly away from his mouth. The lights danced across the stage, highlighting his features, the glitter of his costume, and the intensity in his eyes. The crowd froze for a heartbeat, caught in the spell of the moment, knowing that what would come next would carry the entire stadium with it. Then he leaned back slightly and the band erupted again, the sound filling every inch of space with force. The crowd roared in response, a perfect echo of the energy now fully restored. Elvis didn't just resume performing, he transformed the mood of the night. The chaos of the earlier incident vanished completely. What could have been a moment of humiliation or frustration became a demonstration of charisma and control. Every fan in the stadium felt it, from those nearest the stage to the ones in the upper rows. The music wasn't just heard anymore, it was felt. The vibrations of the drums, the power of the guitars, the clarity of his voice moved through the audience like a living entity, binding them together in a shared experience. He spun lightly, moving across the stage, leaning into the rhythm, and the audience followed instinctively. Hands clapped, feet stomped, voices cheered, all in perfect harmony with the beat. The disruption had become irrelevant. It was erased not through force but through mastery of presence and performance. Every step he took reminded the crowd who was in control, and they responded with full energy, their excitement now heightened rather than diminished. The lights above the stage shifted, painting the scene in dramatic color. Elvis moved with fluidity, stepping forward and back, spinning slightly, the microphone cord moving with him. The audience was fully captured, every movement mirrored by their reactions, every beat amplified by the collective energy. What had begun as tension and disruption was now transformed into a shared triumph. The king had turned a potential disaster into a moment of unforgettable performance. The music and the man. By the time he stepped back toward the center of the stage, the crowd had returned in full force, stronger than ever before. The music surged forward with renewed intensity, the instruments perfectly aligned with his energy. The stadium vibrated with rhythm and excitement. Every person in attendance was caught in the spell of his presence. The night that could have been marred by a single act had been elevated to legendary status. Every fan knew they were witnessing something incredible. The crowd roared as the music reached its peak, the earlier tension finally dissolving into pure excitement. The excitement was no longer tentative or scattered. It was solid, relentless, and contagious. Fans pressed closer to the stage, craning their necks to see every detail. The lights reflected off the glitter of Elvis's white jumpsuit, sending sparks across the front rows. His hair caught the glare of the spotlights, giving him a halo-like presence. Every step he took was fluid, precise, a seamless continuation of the performance. The audience followed instinctively, leaning forward, clapping and stomping in sync with the beat. The earlier disruption had faded into the past, leaving only admiration for the man who had handled it so effortlessly. The band matched his energy perfectly. The music was full, alive and electrifying, each note amplifying the effect of the night. The stadium was a living organism, reacting instantly to the energy of the stage. Every corner vibrated with sound, every person caught up in the wave of rhythm and light. Elvis moved across the stage, stepping forward and back, leaning slightly, spinning lightly. His body language was magnetic, drawing the crowd into his orbit. The audience mirrored him without realizing it, swaying and clapping with perfect timing. Even those in the farthest seats felt connected, pulled into the energy by the sound and movement alone. Every person in the stadium now knew the power of presence, the influence of someone who could command attention without even trying. The spotlight followed him as he stepped closer to the edge of the stage, sweat settling on his forehead and the collar of his jumpsuit, the result of heat, effort, and pure energy. He bent slightly, microphone in hand, letting the rhythm flow naturally through the space. The audience responded instantly. Hands clapped, feet stomped, voices shouted in unison. The stadium was no longer just a place to watch a show. It had become a collective experience, the audience and performer moving as one. Security relaxed slightly, recognizing that the earlier threat had passed. The crowd, sensing this shift, became more daring in their excitement. Fans leaned over the railings, waving and shouting, their voices rising in perfect harmony with the music. There was no fear, no lingering tension, only admiration, enthusiasm, and thrill. Every movement, every gesture, every note reinforced the idea that this night was extraordinary, a night that would be remembered long after the last chord faded. Elvis took another step toward the center of the stage, spinning lightly and swinging the microphone with ease. His voice rang out across the stadium, carrying power and clarity that seemed to make the air vibrate. The music responded in perfect timing, building and falling like a wave across the audience. The cheers and applause were louder than ever, echoing off the walls, bouncing from the back rows to the front. It was as though the stadium itself had become an instrument, amplifying the energy he projected. Elvis moved seamlessly across the stage, bending and spinning, stepping forward and back, never breaking the flow of the performance. The audience mirrored him, lost in the rhythm, swept away by the sound. Even the farthest seats felt the impact of the music, the collective energy filling every corner of the stadium. The excitement was relentless, unbroken, and electric. It was a reminder that a single disruption could never outweigh the mastery and charisma of the man on stage. The band followed every cue, building the tempo higher, layering sound upon sound. Each beat resonated through the crowd, each note met with cheers and claps. As the show continued, the audience regained its confidence. The excitement was no longer hesitant. The disruption that had once threatened the night became a minor memory, replaced entirely by exhilaration. Fans waved, jumped, and clapped in unison, responding to every gesture, every note, every movement of the king. By the end of the song, the stadium shook with applause, cheering, and stomping. Fans were breathless, joyful, and fully alive to the power of the night. The disruption had been erased entirely, replaced by the unforgettable experience of witnessing Elvis command the stage, handle the unexpected, and turn chaos into victory. Every person in attendance knew they had been part of something extraordinary. A night where music, presence, and raw energy combined into a spectacle that would be remembered forever. The mystery behind the scene. When the concert ended, the roar of the crowd still echoed in the air, but the man behind the lights and music had already stepped away from the stage. The noise, thousands of fans, faded into a distant hum as he walked through the backstage corridor. The glare of the lights had been replaced by the dim glow of bare bulbs overhead. The sound of celebration outside felt far away now, as if it belonged to another world. He had given everything to that stage, yet the silence behind it felt heavier than the cheers that filled the night. His dressing room door closed softly behind him. Inside, the air was still, carrying the faint scent of cologne, leather, and the metallic trace of stage equipment. He placed the microphone on the table, where a small mirror caught a glint of his reflection. The makeup around his eyes had smudged slightly, and a few strands of hair had fallen loose, but the intensity in his gaze remained. For a moment he just stood there, breathing slowly, letting his heartbeat settle. The noise of the crowd was gone, but the adrenaline lingered like a current beneath his skin. He sank into the chair, elbows resting on his knees, eyes staring at the floor. The applause still echoed faintly in his mind, not as sound but as memory. He knew the show had gone well, better than anyone expected after the disruption, but he also knew that every performance took something from him. Every night under the lights demanded a price. The image, the energy, the power, it all came from a place that the audience never saw. Behind the voice and the smile was a man constantly balancing exhaustion with perfection. Outside the door, crew members moved, their footsteps soft against the concrete. Technicians unplugged cables, packed up guitars, and rolled away the heavy black speakers that had carried his voice across the stadium. The echo of their work drifted through the walls, faint thuds, low murmurs, the rhythm of an ending that always came too soon. He had just thrilled a massive crowd, yet now, backstage, the world had narrowed to a single room, a single breath. Fame was loud on the outside, but strangely quiet within these walls. He reached for a towel and wiped his face, then leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes. In that darkness, flashes of the night replayed. The heckler's outburst, the tension, the recovery, the roar that followed. Every detail filled his mind like fragments of a film. He had faced moments like this before, but something about tonight felt different. It wasn't anger that stayed with him. It was reflection. He had turned a challenge into glory, yet the thought lingered. How many times could he do this before the weight of expectation became too heavy to bear? A knock came softly at the door. One of his assistants stepped in with a bottle of water and a light nod. He took it, offered a faint smile, then looked back toward the mirror. His reflection stared back also. The man in the reflection looked invincible, yet he could feel the fatigue deep inside his bones. The cheers outside were proof of his success, but they also reminded him of the endless cycle that defined his life. Every victory was followed by another show, another demand, another night of proving himself. He stood again, stretching his arms and rolling his shoulders. The jacket felt heavy now, weighed down not by fabric, but by the pressure it represented. He could hear faint laughter from down the hallway. Band members, crew, maybe even fans trying to steal a moment with him before he left. The world outside that door saw the performer, the icon, the man who could command hundreds and thousands of hearts at once. But behind that door was someone tired, reflective, aware of how fragile control could be. He took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness settle in his throat. Then he looked at the microphone again, still lying on the table. It was just metal and wire, yet it had the power to hold a crowd, to stop chaos, to create history. Every word he spoke through it traveled across oceans of sound, shaping the emotions of thousands. It was both a gift and a burden. The moment he stepped on stage, he belonged to the crowd. Every move watched, every pause magnified. But when the music ended, the silence reminded him of how lonely fame could sometimes feel. Outside, the cheers began to fade as the stadium emptied. The lights dimmed, and the crew continued their gradual dismantling of the show. He stood by the small window, watching the stream of fans moving away from the venue, their faces still glowing with excitement. They would talk about this night for years, the disruption, the recovery, the performance that turned chaos into magic. But none of them would see this part, the solitude that followed the noise, the moment when the performer became human again. He finally reached for his coat and slipped it on. The weight of the night clung to him as he opened the door. When he stepped outside, the air felt cool against his skin. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the freshness. The king of rock and roll had once again conquered the stage, but now, away from the lights, he was simply a man finding his breath. Every night, when the music faded, he stepped out of that world and back into the silence that always waited for him. It was in that balance, between the sound and the stillness, that the legend continued to live. Do you think the night would have been worse if Elvis had reacted differently to the situation? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.